Ah, yes, the Caribert Archin Quest. Lots of juicy little tidbits in there, but there was one thing in particular that completely stole the show, at least for me. Now, you see that big purple rock up there? That's the Sinner, or as I like to call him, Creepy Chasm Chad. He's the most important thing in the entire quest, as far as I'm concerned, and he's also what we're going to spend this entire video investigating. Now, whatever you think is going to be in this video, I promise you, you're gonna be surprised. Unless you already watched this video that Island XD made while I was busy writing this. He and I kind of had a same brain moment, and if you've already watched it, consider this video to be more like an expanded version of the ideas he presented. And of course, he's not the only one. There are definitely a bunch of threads over on Reddit that are talking about some similar ideas that I think are kind of interesting and will be approaching things from a different angle than I will be in this video. So I'm gonna also link those in the description box. Check those out after this video if you're interested. Now, I don't know about you, but I am eager to get this party started and finally get acquainted with our new best buddy, Creepy Chasm Chad, the Sinnerman Crystal Thing. Let's go. I want to start things off by kind of going over the obvious things, the things we already know, and see if we can't narrow down some candidates for the identity of our newfound Sinner friend. The Sinner does not consider himself a god, yet he has so much raw power that hilichurls and humans alike are compelled to bow before him when in his presence. He appears to be sentient as well, but it doesn't seem as though creatures other than the Traveler can necessarily hear him. So either this guy can telepathically speak to the Traveler directly, or the Sinner is actually broadcasting his thoughts, but they're on some sort of inaudible frequency that only the Traveler can pick up on. It's kind of like that thing where the younger you are, the higher frequencies your ears can detect. That is a real thing. I will leave a link. The Sinner is obviously deeply steeped in the power of the Abyss, or is the heart of the Abyss itself, and it looks as though something or someone tried to restrain him somehow, if the chains holding him up are anything to go by, anyway. Unfortunately for whoever tried that, this talking rock doesn't appear to be restricted by earthly constructs like space or time, since he can just kind of blip in and out of existence at will. At least this is my assumption. Now, I doubt someone came along and just physically moved him, especially when Dane goes out of his way to suggest that this Sinner saw the Traveler via the ley line anomaly that allowed the Traveler to witness their twins' memories from hundreds of years ago. It feels far more likely that this thing actually just transcends space and time. Notice, too, how this entire encounter with the Sinner takes place in the chasm, not necessarily in Sumeru. This is the place where hilichurls go to return to goo. A calm, dark place, the depths of which we experienced firsthand during the Perilous Trail quest, and I do seem to recall time getting pretty mucked up back then, too. That may or may not have been the Sinner's influence, since we find him here. The chasm is also the only place so far where we find the Black Serpent Knights, and these guys are known for dropping these weird dark statuettes, carvings of one-eyed figures that emanate a comforting warmth, that make you feel as though it's whispering to you in some strange, comforting ways, and the description says, "See, my child, all that lies under the throne of heaven shall be destroyed by upheaval. The eternal peace of the pitch-dark void shall embrace us all." And it feels like it has some weird kinship with the Sinner itself, right? The Sinner is weirdly comforting. It's a similar shape. It gives tempting whispers. And, I'm not the first to say this, but the dark statuettes appear to be carvings of the one-eyed King Irmin of Khaenri'ah, if only for the fact that they are both explicitly stated to have one eye, and the figures are carried by former knights of Khaenri'ah. I mean, it would make sense for them to carry around a little effigy of their king from which to draw courage from, right? Oh, and Abyss Lectors and Heralds also carry these, which would make sense. But by that logic, the immediate assumption is that the Sinner is King Irmin himself, since the crystal and the dark statuettes have a fair bit in common, right? Well, yes and no. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this, shall we? So King Irmin obviously shares a name with the world tree, Irminsul, but fun fact, Irmin is another name for Odin, which means Irminsul must be another name for Odin's tree, and if you look it up, yes, it is. What, you think it's weird that the king of Khaenri'ah was named after Tevat's memory tree? Well, I think his connection to the tree might have actually been a bit deeper than we think it is. As you probably know, in Norse mythology, Odin hung upside down from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights in order to gain knowledge of other worlds and conquer the power of the runes. Now, weirdly, this myth can also be found in the description for the silver twig we receive after erasing Rukkhadevata. To quote, "In one of the legends, a sage hanging upside down on a tree had acquired the knowledge of how to inscribe runes and control sacred words, and thus followed the kingdom established along the tree's roots, eventually gaining a glimpse of the secret of the cosmos." Now, this passage perfectly describes the feat of Odin acquiring the runes. Yes, it says sage and not king, but it's still a curious coincidence, especially since this is supposed to be one of Rukkhadevata's memory... Wait a minute. A potential reference to the king of Khaenri'ah left for us as one of Rukkhadevata's final memories. And now that I think about it, haven't we seen a violet crystal like this before? Like, kind of recently? Yeah, we have. It was King Deshret, seconds after Rukkhadevata sealed him away for good. He popped up out of the water as a violet crystal in the exact shape of the sinner. Well now, isn't that interesting? Especially when looking back at the quote from the Dark Statuette, since the thoughts expressed there in those lines line up so well with King Deshret's motivations. Okay, you guys probably know where I'm going with this now, especially if you've already seen Island XD's video, so let me preface the rest of this theory with the following disclaimer. It is very possible that Irmin and Deshret are the same person, and I will be making a case for that. But it is equally possible that the story of Deshret and Irmin merely mirror each other, like Deshret's story could be Hoyo's way of previewing Irmin's story for us without telling us about it directly. But I gotta admit, there are a lot of weird little coincidences that just connect the two so well, and if they do end up being the same person, then it would certainly explain why Khaenri'ah is presumably beneath Sumeru. Quick primer on Deshret if you're not familiar with him yet, because he's kind of weird as far as gods go. Not only did he refuse a gnosis from Celestia, he actively plotted against them with the help of the goddess of flowers. The two of them believed that gods were of no use to humanity anymore, and that it was time for humans to become the king of kings upon the tombstone of divinity. The goddess of flowers did not think King Deshret's plans would ever succeed, but she was willing to gamble on him anyway, so she taught him everything he needed to know about the skies and the abyss. She died in the process, but her loyal Jinn pledged their service then to Deshret. This is important for later. Now, Deshret basically let the Jinn rule his people while he left to work on the Golden Slumber, which if you haven't done the quest yet, it's basically a giant abyssal hive mind project. Now, we know that prior to completing the Golden Slumber, Deshret should have had a human-ish form, but we've never actually seen it. Even on the murals of Gurabad, he's depicted as this black multi-pointed star with an eye in the center. And even before we saw this form of Deshret's, we'd seen this symbol once before on the clothing of almost every Khaenri'ah we'd come across. Clothar, Halfdan, Abyss Lectors, and Heralds. It would make sense if the black star symbol came from their leader, don't you think? And let's not forget that the last dynasty of Khaenri'ah was called the Eclipse Dynasty, or in Chinese, the Black Sun Dynasty. And if a sun is also a star, then isn't Deshret a literal black sun? Now, I know this probably sounds weird since Khaenri'ah prided itself in being a nation without gods, and I'm suggesting that it did in fact have a god, but remember, Deshret believed humans had no need for gods and he wished for them to be free to rule themselves. For him to assert that he is no god is kind of on brand. As for calling himself a sinner instead, well, what is someone who rebels against God but a sinner? And interestingly enough, there is this wall in Sumeru that is called the Wall of Samiel, which Rukkhadevata created, presumably, in order to prevent the desert from spreading into the rainforest. Now, I have previously hypothesized that Samiel was another name for Deshret, and in this new context, it makes more sense than ever. Consider this. In Talmudic Midrashic literature, Samiel was called the leader of the rebellious angels. That would make him a sinner for sure, especially since in other texts like the Apocalypse of Baruch, Samiel is equated with the original sin, the one who tempted Eve to consume the apple from the tree of knowledge which got them cast out of heaven, right? But here's where things get really interesting. This same text also paints Samiel as the one who originally planted the Tree of Knowledge to begin with, and that's what got him banished from heaven initially. Now in Genshin, the Tree of Knowledge would be Irminsul, and wouldn't it be incredibly fitting if this tree was named after the person who planted it? King Irmin? What else is interesting is that at the end of days, Samiel would be defeated by the Archangel Michael and chained. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Nahida has chains on her outfit, and her elemental skill is basically just her chaining enemies together. And she's effectively a clone of Rukkhadevata, who sealed away Deshret in the first place. And what is this crystal held up with? 6 chains. Now, in a previous video of mine about the God of Time and the Goddess of Flowers, I made the case for the Goddess of Flowers to be Archangel Uriel on the grounds that the primordial one's 4 shades were likely references to the 4 archangels. Around the same time, the Little Onion That Could made this really cool video about how Rukkhadevata and Nahida might have been a moon sister, and both of us agreed that the moon sisters may have been 3 of the 4 shades of the primordial one. Now, in my case, I made an error and forgot about how the Goddess of Flowers danced alongside the moon sisters and therefore couldn't have been one of them. But this is a correction I will elaborate on in the final video of that series. However, I do think that if you combine our ideas, Nahida and Rukkhadevata seem to be excellent candidates for Archangel Michael, who was the one to chain Samiel. And that would actually change my theory about the Goddess of Flowers being Uriel to her being Lilith, which is a very different discussion. Again, I'll clarify that in the appropriate video. Anyway, rather than getting chained at the end of days, in Genshin, the chaining of Deshret, so to speak, only happens because Deshret unleashed forbidden knowledge on the world. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the label of forbidden knowledge is a little confusing. The truth is, this stuff is basically the same as the dark mud, which is basically like abyssal ley line leakage that you find all over the chasm. And let's face it, ley lines are basically the cause of all abnormalities in Teyvat. Is something weird happening? It's probably a ley line disorder. But the thing is, Irminsul and the ley lines are the same thing, and Irminsul is effectively the memory of the world, and if you tamper with it, you tamper with the fabric of reality as far as Teyvat is concerned. And the roots of this crazy tree stretch down into the abyss. Now, the Caribert Quest established that Khaenri'ahs believe that anyone who could control the abyss could control the world. If we think about it this way, forbidden knowledge may be labeled as such because it is forbidden to control the abyss because the abyss is connected to Irminsul, and tampering with Irminsul is a big no-no. Because, you know, God said so. I mean, improper use of forbidden knowledge may produce side effects like abyssal mudslides, Elazar, withering zones, and mental instability. And yet, through all of this, the Abyss also appears capable of miracles, like how the sinner used the powers of the Abyss to restore Caribert's mind. I mean, it didn't end well, but still, think about the possibilities here. And when we think within this context of he who controls the Abyss controls Teyvat, the Abyss twins starts to make a little bit more sense in terms of their motivation. They are learning to control the Abyss to change Teyvat. They want to restore their homeland. Their homeland of Khaenri'ah. Love that we have that confirmation now. The implications are juicy. Now that we know the twins were thought of synonymously as being of the Abyss and also royalty of Khaenri'ah, there is one more question that needs answering. If Khaenri'ah already had a king, then why did it feel the need to summon the prince and princess from outside of Teyvat? For them to be masters of the Abyss, they must have been originally from Teyvat, right? Even if they've been traveling the stars for thousands of years. So it's not necessarily that they were summoned, but instead that they were called back. And I think they were called back because they were relatives of Deshret. Let me explain. In my Dirge of Bilquis recap video, I talked about how Lilupar took a liking to the Traveler immediately, calling them the shadow of her master, the master being Deshret, of course. I suggested that Lilupar might mean this literally, like the twins looked physically like Deshret, and may have felt the same too if we assume that their powers are similar. Consider too that Samiel was likened to Lucifer oftentimes, and Lucifer was the morning star, which is also what the twins are. And Deshret took the form of what? A black star, and he was called the Son of the Sky, so he could have descended to Teyvat long, long ago, and he was also said to have mastered all the elements. Well, that sounds awfully Traveler-like. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of people trying to refute this idea that Deshret might be literally related to the twins by pointing at Alhaitham and how he's presumably King Deshret reincarnated or referenced or whatever, and Alhaitham looks nothing like the twins. And they'd be right, except that the only thing Alhaitham really has in regards to relations with Deshret are his eyes, and frankly, Dia has a variation of those too. In my opinion, Alhaitham has more in common with the Ibis King, who was called the Scribe of Scribes, and who advised against Deshret making a hive mind, which is exactly what happens in Alhaitham's story quest. Kaveh, on the other hand, is far more interesting of a candidate for a Deshret point of reference. Not only does he actually look as though he could be the older brother of the twins, but he's emotional, mechanically minded, and ambitious. And when it comes to Deshret symbolism on his clothing, he outpaces Alhaitham by a mile. Even his constellation, Paradisia, references the eternal oasis as well as a bird of paradise. Which is funny, because in Christianity, peacocks were associated with paradise. And the Yazidis believed that the Tawisi Malak, or rather the peacock angel, was the highest of all God's angels. Several of the stories of the peacock angel are in line with the Quran's Iblis, who is then equated to the devil of Christianity. And oh hey, we're back at Samiel again. And guess who has a peacock constellation in all of this? Kaya, who's an Albric from Khaenri'ah. Coincidence? Maybe. I don't know. But consider too how Nahida also really likes Kaveh, claiming that he has a near-perfect grasp of true knowledge. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up having some likes and dislikes in common with both Nahida and Nilou, or if he ends up taking over Azar's job as the Grand Sage. Now, don't get me wrong, I am by no means saying that Kaveh is Deshret, okay? That'd be silly, and we already saw what happened with all those Ningguang is Guizhang theories. What I am suggesting is that he is the means by which Hoyo is teasing us about aspects of Deshret in the same way Nilou is not the goddess of flowers, but heavily references her. I could spend an entire video just scrutinizing the symbolism of Kaveh's clothing, and I might, but for now, we're just gonna look at his earrings because I am determined to stay on topic this time. Kaveh's earrings in particular have a lot in common with the structures built by Deshret, which is easy to write off as mere aesthetics, but I think there's a little bit more to it than that. See, during the Caribert quest, we have to find a bunch of these symbols in order to unlock the door that leads to the center. Alusla over on Discord pointed out that this symbol is suspiciously similar to the symbol of the Freemasons, the compass and the square. And if you pay attention, you'll also notice that it matches a lot of Deshret's symbolism all over the desert. And Kaveh's earrings. Freemasons as an organization lean heavily on symbolism to pass on their teachings, and that symbolism comes predominantly from stonemasonry. Things like trowels, compasses, squares, you get the idea, right? Craftsmen's tools. But curiously, a lot of their ceremonies and teachings revolve around the construction of the Temple of Solomon. And I don't need to remind you that Kaveh is an architect. He builds things. He works on machines, right? Is all of this relevant? Yes, because Deshret is also a reference to King Solomon. There's no time for details today, but I will leave a link to a video on the topic where I went way into more depth on that. The TLDR here, though, is that Solomon contracted with the Jinn and had relations with the Queen of Sheba, who was also known by the name of Bilqis and Malikat. Now, if those names sound familiar to you, it's because those are also the epithets for the goddess of flowers. And both the biblical Jinn and the in-game Jinn assisted their respective masters in the construction of their temples. The Jinn helped Deshret build the city of Gurabat and his mausoleum, and the Jinn also helped Solomon build the Temple of Solomon. Therefore, the association between Deshret and Solomon, as well as the relationship between the Temple of Solomon and the Freemasons, matters. So here's the deal. Regardless of what the real Freemasons get up to, it is undeniable that the organization as a whole has been tangled up with contemporary myths and a lot of conspiracy theories, the most famous of which involves the Knights Templar and their search for the Holy Grail. Now, just to be clear, there are historically two groups that call themselves Templars. There's the original Catholic military order Knights Templar, and then there's the Masonic Knights Templar who named themselves after the former. For brevity's sake, I'll just assume that Hoyo has lumped the two together because they like to do that. Most people will hear the Knights Templar and immediately think of the quest for the Holy Grail. I am not going to argue for historical accuracy on this one. Let's just assume that the Knights Templar were either protectors of or in search of the Holy Grail. A grail is also called a cup or a goblet, and as luck would have it, Deshret supposedly built a goblet structure. It's called Deshret's glass goblet, and as you can see, it's at the center of the giant sandstorm where the eternal oasis is. You can see the shape much better in chess form. Curiously, every hooded statue in the ancient chasm ruins and in Khaenri'ah is also depicted carrying a large goblet. Now, Dane once said that this style of architecture resembled Khaenri'ah architecture, but wasn't exactly the same. Is it therefore just a coincidence that Deshret's buildings have a lot of similarities to those of Khaenri'ah, or that the technology seems to operate in the same way? Because it does loosely tie Deshret to Khaenri'ah, regardless. And if the Knights Templar protect or seek the Grail and are connected to the Freemasons who revolve around the Temple of Solomon and whose symbolism has been appropriated by Deshret, who appears to be Genshin Solomon, then we need to follow the Grail. And that takes us to Britain and the Knights of King Arthur. Two of Arthur's knights in particular, Galahad and Percival, went on a quest to seek the Holy Grail, and they did eventually find it. Now, not to shift gears too abruptly, but Mondstadt is a place that is full of Arthurian legend references. There's actually an Arthur standing next to a sword stuck in the ground, and one of Mondstadt's most prolific historical characters is named Parsifal, which is another spelling of Percival. And as I mentioned in the Caribert recap video that I made, the Arthurian legends have long since been associated with the reign of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne came from a long lineage of French monarchs, two of whom are in fact named Clotaire and Caribert. And if tracing things back to Mondstadt feels like a stretch, then let me bridge the gap. Inside the ruin golems, you can find notes from the Khaenri'ah soldiers that piloted them. They called themselves the Swan Knights, and one such squadron of these knights was led by a man named Anfortas. And in Arthurian legend, and in an opera by the name of Parsifal, Anfortas is the name of an immortal king that guards the Holy Grail. Knowing the potential identity of the sinner doesn't necessarily tell us much about his motives beyond challenge heaven and reweave fate. This much we can say for certain now. In fact, the sheer amount of fate and destiny references surrounding the crystal might suggest that it's what's responsible for obscuring the fate of the Abyss Twin. It's a power that Nahida has little to no understanding of, and the sinner has incentive to do it since the Abyss Twin appears to be working in its best interest. And having the twins literally be related to the sinner would explain quite a bit in terms of their relation to Khaenri'ah. The twin that woke first would have learned of their heritage and their destiny over time and slowly grew to understand that the homeland they'd fled all those years ago before they went to space was just lost to time. They would have been literally royalty in exile, as Lilupar put it, traveling the stars with no real goal, only to be called back to Tevat when the time was right. Their job was to be the successor, to carry out the original work of the sinner. And if the sinner is Deshret, then that would make him Solomon, and if Solomon's true purpose was to subjugate the jinn and the demons, well, into that, the demons are the gods, the demon gods, as listed in the Lesser Key of Solomon. And to pull that off, the sinner would probably need something like an army, and who better to serve this purpose than the former citizens of Khaenri'ah? And that's where the Abyss Order comes in for me. Pure-blooded Khaenri'ahs must have had some level of curse resistance, so manipulating their forms into lectors and heralds was probably simple for the sinner. Hilichurls are less useful without their minds, so what if their whole return to goo is just a means by which the sinner could reshape them, return their minds, and then later alter their bodies into something like abyss mages? And Dane's life becomes quite a bit more interesting when viewed alongside all of this new information. If you think about it, he was a royal guard of Khaenri'ah, so his job would have been to protect the king and his heirs. Now, judging by the post-Cataclysm timeline, he did manage to uphold his duty to protect the Abyss Twin right up until they confronted him and forcibly parted ways. But what if the twin blames Dane because Dane betrayed the king, and they're related to the king, and therefore it becomes a lot more personal? And then I wonder, what if Dane just made a judgment call? Decided that no one should be able to wield the power of the Abyss, and betraying the king and then later protecting his heirs was all in the hopes that they would be able to find a different path forward. What if that's the reason why Dane challenges us at the end of our journey, as shown in the Travail trailer? If you hold disdain for the gods, but also don't approve the actions of your own king, you could only hope to try and find a new solution. But in the meantime, you'd remain neutral, trying to prevent the Abyss from encroaching too far, but not assisting the divine either. Now, do I have more thoughts than this? Yes, I absolutely do. But for today's purposes, I am done. That's more or less all I wanted to say about the Sinner. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Creepy Chasm Sinner. Thank you all so much for watching and supporting my channel. I am incredibly lucky to have you guys. Like, really, really, I am. So take care of yourselves. I will see you all in the next video.